Permit me another violation from my ending date to relate to you one of the best stories of Civil War logistics that happened in November of 1863. When the terrible news of the Battle of Chickamauga reached Washington in September, Lincoln met with his cabinet to discuss what to do. Stanton proposed that 30,000 troops could be shifted from Meade's army and reach Rosecrans in 5 days. He was mocked. If the orders were given today, the troops couldn't even reach Washington in 5 days. Stanton backed down just a little. The order was given on September 23rd that 23,000 men were to move. Command was given to Hooker. You remember Joe, who got his clock cleaned at Chancellorsville, and the train started to roll. Now, why am I telling you this in a story about supply? You all know by now that men and material move by written communications. By noon on the 24th, the most powerful railroad officials in the nation were in Stanton's office. They were planning routes, timetables, and the requirements for engines and rolling stock. Troops were assembled at the loading stations. Railroad schedules had to be instantaneously altered. Once again, the telegraph was the technology, but Stanton's plan was the information. The route was cleared, and Hooker's men were entrained on the 25th for Bridgeport, Tennessee. The first of the men arrived after a trip of 1,200 miles in 7 days. The last of the men came in 4.5 days later. Okay, Stanton was a tad off his 5-day forecast, but it was not until the middle of the 20th century that this logistical feat was duplicated. Now, I must tell you, in order to be fair and balanced, that all did not go as smoothly as I have just indicated. Hooker's forces arrived in Nashville with no transportation. Their wagons, teams, and teamsters had only begun leaving Virginia on October 4th, and because the wagons moved much more slowly than trains, did not arrive for another 2 weeks. Further, supplies for this large wagon train were not released as ordered from the Army of the Potomac. So, again, with the aid of the telegraph, wagon supplies that were intended for Nathaniel Banks were rerouted to Hooker. It seems that throughout the war, Commissary Banks was always supplying someone else's army. All of the local quartermaster decisions-making fell on the shoulders of our old friend Simon Perkins, and it was he who collected the wagons and the teams to support this effort. And he did it whilst the supply system sustained much interdiction from the enemy. Although he was able to scrounge some of the needs, it was only the arrival of Hooker's wagon train of some 600 general wagons and 150 ambulances that saved the day. In the middle of all this activity, the Quartermaster General himself appeared on the scene in Tennessee. Now the logistical commands flash back and forth between Meigs and Stanton. This is not unlike the control of Central Command in the Middle East today that is run out of MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. Okay, folks, it's time to review where we are. We started the evening with Bob's question, and we concluded that Bob didn't know what he was talking about. The North did not drop a lot of stuff on the battlefield. However, the South did get a great hoard by seizing federal installations. We then discussed 9 instances of setbacks for the Union and how that really was not a great tragedy of supply. That study led us to investigate the true nature of supply. We just wrapped up how the Union supplied its armies in the field using the dictums laid down by Jessup. What I would like to do now is to flesh out the men already introduced. This will paint a portrait of the handful of people who supplied a million-man army. I have chosen 3 officers, Meigs, Perkins, and a small bit about Swords. I chose these 3 because one was at the top, one was at the bottom, and Swords was in the middle. And it really was a handful of people. As you remember, in 1838, Congress allowed for only 30 senior commissioned quartermaster officers. Now during the war, that number swelled, but the number of federal quartermaster officers never reached 1,500 men, and that includes turnovers, death, and relegation to other duties. It is clear from the early days of Jessup, the quartermaster department was very lean on manpower. In an effort to compensate for quantity, The men who ran supply depended on quality in the officers who they chose to work in this vital service. Meigs had high standards, but he often got what every commander got. That is, some excellent, some average, and some downright poor individuals to populate his command. It was to his credit that he could use the excellent, improve the average, and get rid of the poor. Here is what he wanted in a quartermaster officer. They should be good accountants and persons who have been engaged in business of a mercantile nature. If getting good men was an issue, keeping them was an even greater challenge. In the fighting services, you could expect promotion. Not so in the quartermaster's department. Men who employed thousands of workers, managed strategic shipping operations, or distributed millions of dollars of government funds remained captains for the duration of the war. While some cases of corruption did occur, it was rare. There are 3 reasons for this. Oversight by Meigs and the War Department. 2, the situation of military service. And 3, the officer's personal integrity. As I have been implying, lack of manpower had both positive and negative aspects. One of the best aspects was the short chain of command. A captain in the field like Simon Perkins could wire swords in Cincinnati, who in turn could consult with Meigs and Stanton in Washington, D.C. This could take place within minutes, and the requests, plans, and orders could be carried out within hours. Thus, the problem that I'm going to address next seems to have caused little, if any, disruption in quartermaster services. It was primarily due to the capability of the individual supply officers and the overall organization of the department. The problems caused by the lack of manpower are practically uncountable. And this deficiency was not just in the ranks of the officers. Of the hundreds of examples I could cite, one aspect of the supply issues confronting Buell in his effort to move east in 1862 is an excellent illustration. Among his many needs, Buell wanted teamsters. His chief quartermaster asked Swords to furnish 100 men and then 200 men, and that they be hired, quote, without regard to cost, end quote. With great difficulty, 100 men were sent. It was not enough for the huge volume of government wagon traffic. As he prepared to move out, Buell really needed 300 more. The shortage of teamsters not only posed a threat to Union logistics, but also aggravated the conflict brewing between Halleck and Buell. When Halleck ordered Buell to operate against Chattanooga, he directed Buell to turn over a significant portion of his wagons to the depot in Corinth. To drive his point home, Halleck explained that Buell had twice as much transport as either Grant's Army of the Tennessee or Pope back east. Halleck claimed that Buell's wagons had been idle. Buell retorted that his transportation was hurt by teamsters running off, and besides, he had just been ordered to move east. Old Don Carlos was right about his needs, as rail and river transportation was lacking at that time in northern Alabama. In the end, he got what he needed. It was to Buell's sorrow that he moved too slowly. Later, that was to cost him his job.